Before my only daughter walked down the aisle, I went into a custom suit shop in downtown Dallas for a fitting. Out of nowhere, the shop owner, a man I'd trusted for decades, grabbed my arm, shoved me into a pitch-black fitting room, and whispered, "There's something you need to hear. Stay right here. Don't make a sound. Trust me." I had no idea what was going on, but I kept quiet. A few minutes later, the words I overheard through the thin mahogany paneling made me freeze in place. My blood completely turned to ice. "My name is Harrison Gallagher. I'm 70 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building commercial skyscrapers across Texas. I know how to spot the tiniest hairline crack in a foundation before an entire building collapses. You know how she is, Dad, but God is my witness. It wasn't until I stood in the dark of that fitting room, listening to my future son-in-law casually plan the quiet elimination of my only child, that I realized the deadly fault line running through my own family. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and subscribe to hear how I systematically tore this monster's world apart. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days before the wedding. My daughter, Maya, was the center of my universe. Ever since my wife Martha passed away 7 years ago, Maya was all I had left. At 32, she ran her own art gallery and was practically glowing with happiness. She was engaged to Preston Cole, a 35-year-old who drove flash European sports cars, wore designer clothes, and claimed to be a wealthy tech investor from the East Coast. He had a smooth, rehearsed way of talking, but the way Maya looked at him, you'd think he hung the moon. As a father, when you see your daughter radiating pure joy, you try to swallow your cynicism. I wanted so badly to believe he was a good man. I paid for the entire wedding at an exclusive country club because I wanted to give her the world. That Tuesday, I drove my truck over to Dominic Rossi's shop. Dominic was a master tailor and a close friend I'd known for 25 years. As I pushed through the glass door, the brass bell chimed, and Dominic looked up from a massive bolt of dark silk. The color drained from his face instantly. He rushed over, flipped the door sign to closed, and threw the deadbolt. Before I could even ask what was going on, he grabbed my shoulders and pushed me toward the back of the shop. Dominic shoved me into the back VIP fitting room, the one with heavy velvet drapes and solid mahogany walls. He stared straight into my eyes, his hands trembling against my arms, and told me to stay in the dark and not make a single sound, no matter what I heard. Then he closed the door and locked it from the outside. I was furious and completely bewildered. I almost pounded my fist on the door, thinking my old friend had finally lost his mind. But then I heard the front door unlock and swing open. The brass bell chimed again and heavy footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. 2 pairs of shoes. I recognized those voices immediately. It was Preston, my future son-in-law, and Valerie, his sister and supposed business partner, who had flown into town a week earlier to help with the wedding. You know how she is, Dad. They walked right past my fitting room and stopped in the adjacent lounge area, separated from by just an inch of decorative wood paneling. I stood frozen in the dark, holding my breath, waiting to hear what could possibly be so urgent that Dominic felt the need to lock me up like a criminal. I thought maybe Preston was in financial trouble, or had some minor social scandal he didn't want me to know about. I'm a practical man, fully prepared to help fix a problem. But I was utterly unprepared for pure, unadulterated evil. Preston spoke first, his voice completely stripped of the charming, respectful tone he always used around me and Maya. He let out a low, arrogant chuckle that made my stomach turn. He told Valerie they didn't need to look at any fabric samples today. He said the old man was completely clueless and would sign the medical power of attorney form at the rehearsal dinner, thinking it was just a standard trust setup to avoid taxes. I frowned in the dark, pressing my ear flat against the cold wood. We had discussed setting up a family trust to protect Maya's inheritance, but a medical power of attorney was never part of the original plan. Why on earth did Preston need control over Maya's medical decisions? Valerie answered, her voice cold and sharp as a razor. She told Preston that was perfect. She said, once the ink is dry on that paper, that $10 million life insurance policy goes fully active. And then she uttered the words that made my heart literally stop beating. She said, Maya isn't going to survive that hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. It's going to be a tragic, unavoidable accident, and you'll be the grieving widower holding all the cards. Preston chuckled again, a sickening, terrifying sound. He agreed, saying it was a flawless plan. The air in my lungs turned to heavy ash. My legs felt like they were going to give out right beneath me. My mind flashed back to the honeymoon arrangements. Preston had aggressively insisted on booking a remote, high-altitude alpine trek in Switzerland, claiming it would be a romantic adventure. You know how she is, Dad. My beautiful Maya, who hated the cold and had zero climb experience, had only agreed to make him happy. He was planning to push her off a mountain, and he needed me to blindly sign away my legal rights so I couldn't intervene while she was on life support in a foreign hospital. They stayed in the shop for another agonizing 5 minutes, calmly discussing how quickly they could liquidate my commercial real estate portfolio once they had full control over my daughter's estate. Every casually spoken word was a heavy sledgehammer smashing into the foundation of my entire life. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I let the absolute darkness of that fitting room swallow my initial shock and carefully convert it into pure, unadulterated rage. I heard the bell on the shop door ring as they finally stepped back out into the sunshine. Dominic unlocked my door immediately. He was dripping with sweat, looking at me with total pity and terror. I didn't say a word to him. I just reached out, gripped his shoulder in silent gratitude, and walked straight out the front door. I climbed into my heavy truck, grabbed the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned completely white, and slammed my heavy boot onto the gas pedal. I didn't call the police. I had no audio evidence, just my word against his, and I knew Maya was completely under his manipulative spell. I drove straight through Dallas traffic toward my daughter's apartment building. The fury burning inside my chest was a living, breathing monster. I was going to kick her front door off its hinges. I was going to tear Preston apart piece by piece until he confessed to everything. To every parent listening out there, never let the fear of pushing your child away stop you from trusting your ultimate instincts. Predators don't come with warning labels. They disguise themselves as everything your child ever wanted. They use charm as a weapon and isolation as a daily tool. If someone enters your family and suddenly the dynamic becomes toxic, if your child changes or starts pulling away, do not politely step aside. Investigate. Ask the hard questions. Gather your evidence in the shadows. It is far better to be the villain in their eyes for a month than to spend the rest of your life grieving them. If this story proves that a father's love is the ultimate shield, hit that like button right now and subscribe to hear more stories of survival and absolute justice. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from today. Now, back to what happened next. I threw my truck into park at the curb, ignoring the fire lane rules. My boots slammed against the concrete floor of the lobby as I pushed past the concierge. I marched into the elevator and hit the button for the penthouse suite, my chest heaving. The doors slid open, and I didn't even bother to knock. I slammed my hand against the oak door, throwing it open with a deafening crash against the wall. Maya gasped, dropping a stack of wedding invitations onto the hardwood floor. Preston was sitting on the modern leather sofa, sipping a glass of sparkling water. He didn't flinch, he didn't jump up. He just looked at me with cold, hollow eyes, the eyes of a predator calmly analyzing its prey. I crossed the living room in 3 heavy strides. "How she is, Dad," pointing my finger straight at his face. I told him I knew exactly what he was planning. I confronted him about the medical power of attorney. I confronted him about the $10 million insurance policy and the sudden trip to the Swiss Alps. I turned and begged Maya to leave him, pleading with her to believe that he and his so-called sister were planning to take her life. I was ready for him to break, to stutter, or to try to physically engage with me right there in the living room. Instead, Preston did the most terrifying thing imaginable. He simply sighed, set his glass down on the coffee table, and looked at Maya with an expression of deep, wounded sympathy. He stood up slowly, holding his hands open in a posture of complete surrender. His voice was so smooth, so perfectly calibrated, it made me sick. He calmly stated that he understood why I was confused, completely ignoring my explosive anger. Walking over to a leather briefcase on the counter, he pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He spread them across the kitchen island, flattening the crisp paper with his manicured hands. Turning to Maya, he touched her arm gently to reassure her before looking right at me. He patiently explained that the trust paperwork was standard procedure for high-net-worth families entering a marriage. He claimed that with my commercial real estate portfolio in Dallas, Maya was facing a massive tax burden. He spoke about federal estate taxes, throwing around complex financial jargon with the precision of a seasoned corporate lawyer. He claimed the medical power of attorney was just a standard, routine add-on attached by the attorneys to ensure Maya was protected if anything ever happened to me, not the other way around. He spun the narrative so flawlessly that for a split second, even I questioned my own sanity. Then I brought up the $10 million life insurance policy. I shouted that it was a clear motive for harm. Preston still didn't raise his voice. He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a letter from a bank. Looking at Maya with utter devotion, he explained that the life insurance was a mandatory requirement from the private lender to secure the mortgage on a new estate in Beverly Hills he was purchasing for their future together. He said it was a financial safety net to ensure that if he passed away unexpectedly, Maya would never be burdened with debt. He made it sound unbelievably romantic, like the ultimate act of a protective husband. As for the Swiss Alps, he smiled softly and reminded Maya that it was supposed to be a surprise. He explained that it was a luxury tour guided by professional Sherpas with high security and supervision, not some dangerous solo climb. He played the victim so masterfully. Looking at me with sorrowful eyes, he quietly asked why I hated him so deeply that I would invent a horrific conspiracy just days before the happiest moment of their lives. I turned to my daughter in desperation, expecting her to see through his slick lies. I begged her to listen, trying to tell her about Dominic, the tailor shop, and the chilling conversation I had just overheard from the fitting room. But when I looked into Maya's eyes, I didn't see the little girl I had raised and protected. I saw a complete stranger, totally consumed by a carefully constructed illusion, her face flushed with intense anger. Her hands were shaking, but her fury was directed entirely at me. She stepped firmly in front of Preston, shielding him from my rage. She told me I had completely lost my mind. Her voice cracked as she brought up her mother, saying that ever since Martha died 7 years ago, I had become paranoid, suffocating, and obsessed with control. She accused me of trying to ruin her happiness because I was terrified of ending up alone in my old age. Every word she spoke was a dagger aimed directly at my deepest emotional vulnerabilities. I tried to speak, to explain the coldness in Valerie's voice, the sheer malice I heard through that wooden wall, but Maya held her hand up firmly, refusing to hear another word. She said I had spent my life building cold, lifeless steel structures, and now I was trying to destroy the only beautiful thing she had built for herself. She cried bitterly, saying Preston had done nothing but support and love her unconditionally, while I was acting like a bitter old man trying to sabotage her future. The look of betrayal in her eyes was devastating. Pointing a trembling finger toward the open penthouse doorway, she screamed at me for ruining her life and sabotaging her wedding. She told me to leave, and not to come back until I was ready to apologize and accept the man she loved. I stood there looking at the two of them. Preston wrapped his arms around her shoulders, kissing the top of her head as she sobbed against his chest. Over her shaking shoulder, he looked straight at me. A slow, chilling smirk crept across his face, the undeniable smirk of a man who was confident he had just won the first battle. In that moment, I realized that fighting him out in the open would only push Maya further into his trap. If I kept pressing, she would cut me off completely, and then she would be entirely defenseless up in those cold mountains. I turned around and walked slowly out of the apartment, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I stood alone in the quiet, carpeted hallway, completely severed from my only child. I had zero physical evidence to present to the police and no allies left in her life. But I knew the absolute, horrifying truth. And if Preston wanted to play a game of shadows to steal my legacy and harm my daughter, he was about to learn just how ruthless a loving father could be. As I walked to the elevator, a new plan took shape. I was going to systematically dismantle every single piece of his existence, brick by brick, until he had nowhere left to hide. I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, forcing my bruised ego to surrender to cold logic. As an engineer, I knew that if you attack a solid wall head-on, you only break your own tools. You have to find the stress points, and to do that, you need access. The next morning, I picked up my phone and did the hardest thing I've ever done. I called my daughter and I lied. I made my voice shake. I forced a pathetic, fragile tone, making myself sound frail and old. I apologized repeatedly for my outburst, blaming my behavior on the lingering grief of losing her mother, and claiming the thought of giving her away had triggered a panic attack. I swallowed every ounce of my pride and begged for her forgiveness. Maya hesitated, suspicion clear in her voice, but she was fundamentally good-natured. She sighed, her tone softening, and invited me to join them for a Sunday brunch at the country club to clear the air. She said Preston had actually encouraged her to give me another chance. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and felt a cold, sharp resolve settle deep in my bones. Sunday morning brought blinding sunshine. Dressed in a tailored suit and wearing a mask of remorse, I walked out onto the country club patio. Maya, Preston, and Valerie were seated at a table overlooking the 18th hole. I approached with an apologetic smile, playing the role of a humbled elder who had learned his place. Preston stood up to greet me, his expression radiating a smug, magnanimous victory. He played the gracious winner perfectly, pulling out my chair and ordering me a coffee. Valerie sat across from him, sipping a mimosa, her eyes tracking my movements with calculated precision. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and completely shifted my mindset. I stopped talking and started observing. I shut off the emotional side of my brain, the side screaming to grab Preston by the throat, and activated my analytical engineer's mind. I began scanning for the tiniest cracks in their facade. Preston dominated the conversation, bragging about his wealthy upbringing in Boston, casually dropping names of elite boarding schools and exclusive yacht clubs. Resting his left arm on the white tablecloth, he prominently displayed a gold vintage Rolex. Noticing me looking at it, he proudly declared, "It's an heirloom passed down from my grandfather, an industrial tycoon." From a distance, it was a beautiful timepiece, but my eyes were trained to catch millimeter variations in steel beams from 50 yards away. As he reached for a glass of water, the sunlight hit the watch face perfectly. I watched the second hand. In a genuine vintage mechanical Rolex, the second hand sweeps in a continuous, fluid motion. But Preston's watch didn't sweep. It gave a stiff, distinct tick, jumping once per second. It was a quartz movement. The watch was a cheap, mass-produced replica wrapped in a shiny gold shell. Just like the man wearing it, it was a fraud. A small crack in the foundation had just opened up. My mind raced, filing that detail away, while I casually nodded along to his fabricated family history. A few minutes later, the waiter brought our plates. While adjusting my silverware, I deliberately knocked my cloth napkin off my lap, letting it flutter down to the stone floor. Bending down to retrieve it, my eyes swept beneath the table for a fraction of a second. What I saw made my blood run cold. Valerie, the woman introduced to the world as his sister, had slipped her high heels off. Her bare foot was resting high on the inside of Preston's thigh, her toes slowly and intimately stroking his leg. It was an unmistakably romantic gesture, something no sister would ever do. They were relaxed, entirely confident in their deception, believing the foolish old man across the table was completely oblivious to their game. I sat up straight, keeping my face completely expressionless, though my heart was hammering a dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I shifted my focus to Maya. Throughout the entire brunch, my vibrant, energetic daughter had barely spoken 3 words. She slouched in her chair, her posture defeated. Her usually radiant skin was pale, almost translucent, and she stared at her untouched food with hollow, unfocused eyes. When the waiter asked if she wanted a refill, she blinked several times, as if struggling to process the simple question. Preston immediately stepped in, placing a gentle but controlling hand over hers, smoothly answering for her. He claimed she was just exhausted from wedding planning and needed rest. Maya simply nodded, a slow, mechanical movement, and rested her heavy head against his shoulder. The terrifying truth hit me like a freight train. She wasn't just tired. She was severely lethargic, stripped of her natural agency. The conversation I overheard in the tailor shop echoed violently in my head. They were systematically drugging her, keeping her trapped in a compliant chemical fog so she wouldn't notice the red flags, ensuring she would blindly sign whatever documents they put in front of her. Every protective instinct inside me screamed to jump up, flip the table, and pull my daughter out of that club right then and there. I wanted to call the police, demand a blood test, and expose them to the entire restaurant. But my engineer's brain forcibly subdued my emotions, stopping me before I made a fatal error. If I called the cops right now, what would actually happen? I had no physical proof, just a fake watch and a quick glimpse under a table. Under the heavy influence of whatever substance they were feeding her, Maya would undoubtedly defend Preston. The police would see a dramatic family dispute, a father making wild accusations against a devoted fiancé. They would leave, and Preston would immediately realize how deep my suspicions ran. He would accelerate his timeline, isolate Maya completely, and execute his plan far beyond my reach. Impulsive action would be tantamount to signing my daughter's death warrant. I couldn't rely on instincts or indirect observations. I needed rock-solid, irrefutable evidence. I needed bank records, toxicology reports, and a complete paper trail of fraud that no lawyer, police officer, or judge could ignore. I needed devastating proof. Playing my assigned role perfectly, I endured the rest of the brunch. I smiled, laughed at Preston's fake jokes, and kissed Maya's pale cheek when we parted ways in the parking lot. I watched as Preston guided her into his sports car like a villain, leading a captive princess into a trap. I waved goodbye, keeping a soft, apologetic smile on my face until their car disappeared around the corner. The moment they were out of sight, the smile vanished. Walking back to my truck, my mind was already calculating the complex geometry of their destruction. The game of shadows had begun, and I was going to tear their world apart. First thing the next morning, I drove to the main branch of my bank in downtown Dallas. Wearing a plain jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, I bypassed the main teller line and walked straight into the private wealth management office, taking a seat across from my banker. I told him I needed $100,000 in untraceable cash. He looked at me with deep concern, gently asking if I was in trouble. I forced a tired smile, telling him I was making a quiet, highly confidential investment in a private project. He didn't push further. An hour later, I walked out of that bank carrying a heavy leather duffel bag, the weight of the stacked bills heavy against my side. Out of the bank, I drove straight to a nondescript office building on the industrial edge of town. I wasn't looking for a standard private investigator who just snapped pictures of cheating spouses. I needed a ghost. I needed someone who operated entirely in the shadows, someone who understood the intricate mechanics of high-level financial fraud. I made a few discreet calls to my old contacts in commercial construction, the guys who had handled corporate espionage, and every single one of them gave me the exact same name, Victor Thorne. Victor was a former federal financial investigator who had been forced out of the agency a decade ago because of his completely ruthless methods. He didn't care about legal red tape. He cared about results. I walked into his sparsely furnished office and threw the heavy leather duffel bag directly onto his metal desk. Unzipping the top, I exposed the stacks of $100 bills. Victor barely blinked. He leaned back in his squeaky chair and asked me who we were destroying today. I told him everything. I detailed the conversation in the tailor shop, the fake watch, the suspicious legal documents, and my daughter's terrifying physical condition. Victor listened in absolute, precise silence. When I finished, he simply nodded, pulled a clean notepad from his drawer, and told me we were going to trace every single breath this man had ever taken. Before Victor and I made our move, I needed to create a massive distraction. I needed Preston to feel completely victorious and absolutely secure. Driving back home, I packed a large golf bag, making sure to call Maya right as I loaded the clubs into my trunk. I forced my voice to sound thoroughly defeated, playing the role of a broken father who had finally thrown in the towel. I told her our terrible fight had completely shaken me, and that I had let my lingering grief over her mother ruin the most important week of her life. I said I was flying down to a secluded golf resort in Florida to clear my head, decompress, and prepare to walk her down the aisle with a genuine smile. Preston was right there in the background. I could hear him urging Maya to put me on speaker. He piped in, his voice dripping with fake, sugary concern. He told me it was a brilliant idea, assuring me that Florida was exactly what I needed to relax. He promised to take flawless care of Maya in my absence, telling me to focus on my golf swing and leave the rest of the wedding stress to them. Swallowing the bile rising in my throat, I thanked him, told Maya I loved her more than life itself, and hung up the phone. Preston thought he had successfully banished the nuisance of an old man 1,000 miles away to a golf course. He had made a fatal mistake. I didn't fly to Florida. I drove to a private airfield just outside of Dallas, where Victor had already chartered an untraceable light jet using a shell company account. We boarded in absolute silence, carrying only 2 small overnight bags and a pair of heavy laptops. As the jet climbed into the sky and banked sharply toward the East Coast, Victor laid out the wedding invitation Preston had so proudly designed. The heavy, cream-colored cardstock was printed with a beautiful crest and an elegant return address for his family. Preston had bragged relentlessly about his generational wealth, claiming his family owned a massive historic estate in one of Boston's most exclusive old-money neighborhoods. He had spun elaborate stories over dinners about growing up in a sprawling stone mansion with manicured gardens and luxury cars. He said his parents were currently on a European cruise and would fly directly to Dallas just in time for the Sfruel dinner. It was a perfectly constructed narrative designed to make my daughter feel like she was marrying into royalty. But as Victor typed furiously on his laptop, tapping into restricted databases using backdoors the federal government thought they had closed, years ago, the cracks began to multiply. Victor pulled up property tax records, municipal utility bills, and zoning permits. The Boston address on the wedding invitation didn't belong to the Cole family. In fact, over the last 50 years, there was absolutely no record of a wealthy Cole family existing in that prestigious zip code. We landed under dreary, overcast Boston skies. The air was bitterly cold, cutting right through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. We rented an inconspicuous sedan and drove straight into the city. Driving through the narrow, winding streets, I gripped the steering wheel tight as the GPS guided us closer and closer to the address printed on that elegant wedding invitation. My heart hammered an unforgiving rhythm against my ribs. We turned off the main wealthy avenues and drove into a run-down industrial side street. The grand historic mansions with sweeping lawns were quickly replaced by cracked sidewalks and tall chain-link fences. I brought the sedan to a slow stop right at the exact coordinates Preston had published to the world. Putting the car in park, I stared through the windshield in absolute, horrified disbelief. There was no heroic stone mansion. There were no manicured gardens or grand libraries. The address belonged to a dilapidated, abandoned strip mall. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood covered in peeling graffiti and faded gang symbols. The parking lot was an ocean of weed-choked, cracked asphalt strewn with broken glass and rusted shopping carts. The specific unit number listed as his family's estate was nothing more than the tiny, ruined storefront of a discount liquor store, its faded awning sagging dangerously toward the ground below. Victor sat quietly in the passenger seat, his dark eyes locked onto the complete desolation before us. He slowly closed his heavy laptop and turned his head to look straight at me. The silence inside the small car was thick and suffocating. The terrifying, massive scale of the lie left me almost breathless. Preston wasn't a wealthy tech investor from an old money family at all. The man currently sleeping next to my heavily drugged daughter, the man systematically preparing to take over her entire life, didn't actually exist. The upcoming wedding was a total sham, and Preston was an absolute, terrifying ghost. Victor didn't waste a second staring at the ruined building. He snapped his heavy laptop back open, the pale glow of the screen casting long shadows across his intense face. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a practiced, frightening speed. Bypassing standard public directories, he hacked directly into municipal tax registries and property ownership archives. He linked the address of that abandoned liquor store to a web of hidden shell companies. The layers of deception were incredibly dense, meticulously designed to defeat any standard background check. But Victor wasn't a standard investigator. He was a predator who hunted financial criminals for a living. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, listening in silence to the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his keys, my eyes locked on the rotting plywood covering the ruined storefront. Damp, freezing Boston air seeped through the car windows, but inside my chest, a white-hot, suffocating rage was beginning to build. Victor broke the silence, his voice a low, steady hum. He explained that the shell company registered to this address was a paper dead end, but every shell company had a registered agent and a bank routing number used to pay the minimum state filing fees. He ran that routing number through a specialized financial database, tracing where the money was coming from. A dizzying array of bank records, wire transfers, and offshore accounts began popping up on the screen. It was a complex web of stolen funds, systematically laundered and redirected through shell corporations. Victor pointed to a specific series of transactions. He showed me how the money was being systematically cleaned and redirected straight into a high-yield checking account back in Dallas, Texas. That single account was the lifeline of his fictional existence. It paid for the European sports car. It paid for the custom suits. It funded the lavish dinners at five-star restaurants and the illusion of a wildly successful tech investor. Every single cent of his flashy lifestyle had been violently siphoned from the accounts of unknown victims, funneled right through this rotting strip mall. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the numbers representing millions of stolen dollars slide across the dark display. A wave of sickening disgust washed over me. Leaning my head back against the cold glass of the car window, I closed my eyes. My mind drifted back to the sweltering, unforgiving heat of Texas summers. I thought about the 40 years I had spent building my commercial real estate portfolio. I hadn't inherited a single dime. Starting out as a junior structural engineer in steel-toed boots and a hard hat, I walked construction sites in over 100-degree heat before the concrete was even dry. I willingly worked grueling 80-hour weeks, missing countless family dinners, school plays, and weekend baseball games, simply because I was bound and determined to build an unbreakable foundation for my wife and daughter. I remembered the physical toll it took on my body, the permanent ache in my lower back, the calluses on my hands that never quite faded, the endless nights sitting awake at the kitchen table, agonizing over blueprints and supply chain budgets. I poured my actual sweat and blood into the Dallas dirt to create a legacy of security and respect. I built skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, structures designed to withstand the violent forces of nature. I did it all so Maya would never have to know the crushing weight of poverty or the desperate fear of instability. And now, sitting in this freezing rental car, I was forced to look at the exact opposite of everything I stood for. He was a parasite. He was a hollow, worthless shell of a man who didn't build or create anything. He simply hunted down innocent people who had worked hard their entire lives. People who were exceptionally trusting and vulnerable, and systematically drained their financial accounts completely dry. He was trying to hijack my 40 years of relentless sacrifice overnight. He wanted to take the empire I built for my daughter and use it to fund his pathetic, criminal vanity. The sheer audacity of his parasitic existence made the blood inside me boil with deadly intensity. I opened my eyes, the sorrow burning away completely, leaving behind only a hard, calculated resolve. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to utterly dismantle him. Victor let out a sharp breath. The rapid clicking of his keyboard abruptly stopped. Leaning close to the display, his eyes narrowed as he read a newly decrypted file. The backlight of the screen illuminated a sudden shift in his expression. The former federal investigator's usually cold professionalism was replaced by genuine, unadulterated shock. He slowly shook his head, muttering under his breath about how unbelievably sloppy the guy was for someone playing such a high-stakes game. I demanded to know what he had found. Leaning over the center console, my eyes scanned the complex blocks of text on his screen. Victor pulled up a digitized police record from a department in Nevada dating back over a decade. He explained that by cross-referencing the funding source accounts with old wire fraud warrants, he had finally bypassed the fake identity. Preston Cole didn't exist at all. It was an alias created 4 years ago. His real name was Thomas Vance. He was actually a convicted fraudster who had served 3 full years in a medium-security state prison for ruthlessly orchestrating a massive real estate scam specifically targeting vulnerable elderly widows. He had a documented history of financial predation. My chest tightened. The man sleeping next to my daughter was a convicted felon. But Victor wasn't done yet. His fingers started moving across the keyboard again, even faster this time. Opening a separate browser window, he accessed a heavily restricted public records database. He typed in the real name, Thomas Vance, alongside the name Valerie Cross, cross-referencing their past addresses and known associates. A progress bar loaded across the screen, stretching the agonizing tension inside the silent car. Suddenly, a high-resolution scanned document appeared on the display. It was an official state record bearing an embossed seal and a series of clear signatures. Victor downloaded the file and opened it full screen. He stared at it for a long, heavy moment. Slowly closing his eyes, he let out a deep, heavy sigh and then slammed his silver laptop shut with a sharp click. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot inside the small cabin. He turned his head and looked me straight in the eyes. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, cold and absolute. He told me to brace myself. Gently laying his right hand flat on the closed laptop, he whispered the exact words that would officially launch the complete, irreversible destruction of the reality carefully crafted around my beloved daughter. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a raspy tone, "they aren't brother and sister." I stared at Victor, the damp chill of the Boston evening fading away, replaced by a freezing numbness in my chest. I made him repeat what he had just said. Victor didn't repeat it. Instead, he tapped the screen of his laptop, zooming in on the scanned file until the text filled the entire display. I reached across the center console, scanning the heavily watermarked paper. It was a marriage certificate issued in Clark County, Nevada. The date stamped at the top showed it had been filed exactly 8 years ago. My eyes moved down to the signatures at the bottom. The first signature belonged to Thomas Vance, the convicted felon I knew as Preston Cole. The second signature belonged to Valerie Vance, the woman currently living in my daughter's guest room, eating our food and posing as his loving, supportive sister. They weren't brother and sister. They were legally bound husband and wife. The absolute depravity of their deception hit me like a physical blow. My mind flashed back to the country club brunch, back to the horrific image beneath the white tablecloth where Valerie stroked Preston's leg with her bare foot while my beautiful drugged daughter sat right across from them. Victor kept his voice low and steady, analyzing the situation with the detached precision of a seasoned investigator. He explained that we were dealing with a highly organized, deeply experienced team of con artists. Pulling up another document, he outlined a pattern of operation that made my blood turn to ice. This was their playbook. They systematically targeted wealthy, emotionally vulnerable women, women who were isolated or grieving, who desperately wanted love and validation. Preston would put on a carefully crafted fake identity, playing the role of the perfectly charming suitor. He would sweep the victim off her feet with lavish attention and forged wealth. Meanwhile, Valerie would insert herself into the dynamic as the protective yet welcoming sister, providing a false sense of family and stability to complete the intricate illusion. Once the trap was set and the victim was thoroughly isolated from her real family and friends, they moved in without mercy or hesitation. But this time, Victor pointed out, his dark eyes serious and deep, the stakes are infinitely higher. Maya isn't just a wealthy target with a healthy savings account. Maya is the sole heir to a commercial real estate empire built over 40 years. And more importantly, she's about to be tied to a brand new $10 million life insurance policy. They weren't just planning to steal her money, take my property, and run. They were planning to steal my entire legacy and then execute my only child in the freezing mountains of Switzerland to cash in on the ultimate prize. You know how she is, Dad. Leaning back against the hard passenger seat, I struggled to draw oxygen into my burning lungs. I had spent my entire life calculating load-bearing walls, assessing stress points, and reinforcing foundations with solid steel. I knew how to protect structures from hurricanes and earthquakes, but nothing could have prepared me for the structural collapse of my own family. The monsters were already inside the house. They were sleeping under my daughter's roof, slowly poisoning her mind and body with whatever toxic cocktail they were slipping into her daily routine. I closed my eyes, forcing back the sudden, overwhelming wave of tears. I couldn't cry. I couldn't afford the luxury of grief or panic. What Maya needed right now was an engineer. She needed a father who could build a trap so devastating and seamless that these parasites would never see another sunrise. Victor interrupted my thoughts, asking how we should proceed. He suggested taking this newly discovered marriage certificate straight to the local police, hoping they could arrest Thomas Vance under his real name on pending warrants or probation violations. I shook my head, my jaw set with absolute, unshakable determination. I told Victor that arresting him on an old wire fraud charge would only land Thomas Vance in jail for a few short months. Valerie would post his bail, and then they would vanish into the wind, gone forever before I could secure Maya's safety. I needed them to face legal justice for attempted murder. I needed to expose their ongoing conspiracy in a way that left them with absolutely no legal wiggle room or space for a reduced plea deal. I told Victor we were sticking to the original plan. We had to let them walk directly into the trap at the rehearsal dinner. Just as the words left my mouth, the sudden vibration of my phone startled us both. It buzzed loudly in the cup holder between our seats. Picking it up, I looked at the bright screen, my hands trembling slightly. It was a text message from Maya. Seeing her name brought a painful lump to my throat. Unlocking the phone, I opened the message, expecting a brief update or perhaps another defensive argument about our terrible fight. Instead, the words I read caused my blood to freeze solid in my veins once again. Maya had written, "Preston says my vitamins are making me dizzy, so we moved our trip to the Swiss Alps up by 2 days. We're leaving right after the reception." I read it a second time and then a third, my eyes locked on those glowing white letters. Preston was accelerating the timeline. He knew the heavy sedatives and beta blockers he was feeding her were producing visible effects. He knew she was growing dangerously weak, likely too weak to survive a long wedding reception. Or perhaps he had sensed my sudden shift in attitude at the brunch and realized his window of absolute safety was closing fast. Whatever his reason, he was panicking. He was manipulating her into leaving the country immediately after the reception, completely bypassing the 2-day buffer period we had originally planned on. He was moving her off American soil, away from my protection and away from U.S. law enforcement, much faster than I had anticipated. I handed the phone to Victor. He read the brief message in silence, his jaw tightening. "You know how she is, Dad." Looking at me, he confirmed the terrifying reality of our new situation. Our window to strike back had just been violently moved up by 48 hours. We didn't have the luxury of time to prepare evidence for the authorities. We were now operating under an extremely dangerous, highly compressed timeline. The rehearsal dinner was no longer just the final piece of the trap. It was the absolute deadline. If I failed to stop them there, if I failed to execute the plan flawlessly, Maya would be on a private jet bound for Europe before midnight, and I would never see my daughter alive again. Taking a deep, shaky breath, the freezing Boston air filled my lungs. I turned the key and the heavy engine roared to life. I threw the bulky rental car into drive. I had less than 72 hours to save her life. The countdown echoed inside my head. There was absolutely no time left to process marriage certificates or the sickening reality of their deep deception. I looked at Victor sitting in the freezing rental car and told him we needed to be back in Texas before sunset. Leaving the abandoned Boston strip mall behind, we drove straight back to the private airfield. The flight back to Dallas was agonizingly quiet. I mapped out the layout of the penthouse apartment I had bought her in my head, calculating blind spots and preparing myself. I was no longer just an angry father trying to protect his daughter. I was an engineer about to completely dismantle a hostile structure from the inside out. The moment our wheels touched the Texas tarmac, Victor opened his laptop and accessed the cellular tracking software he used to locate financial fugitives. Within minutes, he confirmed that Preston and Maya were across town at a bakery doing a final cake tasting. Valerie was registered at a bridal boutique, picking up the final altered dresses. The penthouse was currently empty, but the window of opportunity was terrifyingly narrow. I had Victor park the car 2 blocks away from the luxury high-rise, and then I walked toward the building with my head held low. Bypassing the main lobby entirely, I utilized the underground service entrance I remembered from the original architectural blueprints. Slipping into the freight elevator, I rode it up to the penthouse floor, my pulse pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. As the heavy metal doors slid open, I stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. Standing before the massive oak door of their apartment, I stared at the lock. Preston had bragged about installing a military-grade smart lock system. To a structural engineer who had spent decades designing commercial security entry points, it was nothing more than a puzzle waiting to be solved. Kneeling down, I examined the digital keypad and the underlying mechanical tumbler. I pulled a small tension wrench and a bypass probe from my pocket. Inserting the probe into the tiny maintenance gap beneath the casing, I felt around for the magnetic latch. With a slow, deliberate twist of my wrist, I cut the current just long enough for the deadbolt to disengage. The heavy door gave a soft, yielding sigh and clicked open. Stepping inside, I closed the door silently behind me. The apartment smelled of expensive vanilla candles and impending doom. I didn't waste a single second looking at the stack of wedding gifts piled in the living room. Moving with silent, purposeful strides, I headed straight for the primary suite. Searching for the room Preston claimed as his private home office. Turning the handle, I pushed the door open. The space was meticulously organized, projecting the false image of an exceptionally successful executive. I began to search systematically. Checking the drawers, the filing cabinets, and the secret compartments of the desk yielded nothing. Preston was a convicted fraudster. He would never leave his most dangerous secrets in a standard drawer. He needed a secure, hidden anchor point. Stepping back, I evaluated the room with an architect's eye. I calculated the square footage, comparing the internal dimensions of the office against the hallway outside. There was a discrepancy. The wall behind his mahogany desk was nearly 8 inches thicker than standard construction. I walked around the desk and ran my hands over the smooth drywall. Tapping the surface with my knuckles, the sound shifted from a hollow echo to a dull, dense thud about 3 feet off the floor. Feeling along the baseboard, I located an almost invisible seam. Pressing my fingers hard against the edge of the panel, a small section of the wall popped open on a hidden spring hinge. Behind the panel sat a heavy, fireproof steel safe. It was a mechanical combination dial, not a digital keypad. As I knelt before it, my breathing turned shallow. Cracking a mechanical safe required absolute silence and a deep understanding of frictional mechanics. Pressing my ear directly against the cold steel door, I closed my eyes to isolate my hearing. Grabbing the dial, I began turning it at an agonizingly slow pace. I listened for the tiny, microscopic metallic click as the internal wheels dropped into place. It was a game of tactile feedback, feeling the slight resistance as the locking mechanism engaged with the pins. The first number gave a heavy click. Reversing direction, I felt the precise moment the second pin caught. I spun the dial right one last time, and the third click echoed loudly in my own ears. Jerking the heavy handle down hard, the steel door swung open, revealing the dark interior. Reaching inside the safe, I pulled out a small black plastic tray. Sitting in the center of the tray was a cheap, disposable burner phone. But the object sitting right next to the phone made my blood freeze solid. It was a standard amber prescription pill bottle with all the pharmacy labels aggressively peeled off. In their place, a strip of white masking tape was wrapped around the plastic. Written on the tape were the simple words, Maya's Vitamins. Unscrewing the child-proof cap with trembling fingers, I looked inside. The bottle was filled with a heavy stash of unmarked blue capsules. These weren't vitamins. These were the chemical chains holding my daughter to her executioner. I dumped the bottle upside down, precisely pinching out 2 blue pills and tucking them deep into my breast pocket for toxicological testing. Twisting the child-proof cap back into place, I carefully put the bottle back down in the exact spot where I found it. Suddenly, a sharp chime shattered the dead quiet of the apartment. The private elevator bell chimed right in the penthouse suite. Panic surged in my chest. They were back early. I slammed the plastic tray back into the safe, shoved the heavy steel door shut, and kicked the hidden wall panel straight into place. Scrambling to my feet, my heart pounded violently against my ribs. I heard the lock on the front door click open, followed by Preston's smooth voice echoing down the foyer. Darting out of his office, I made a silent sprint down the short hallway, slipping into the emergency fire stairwell a fraction of a second before Preston turned the corner into the living area. Pulling the heavy fire door shut behind me, I left a tiny crack less than half an inch wide. Standing motionless with my back pressed flat against the concrete wall, I listened as Preston moved briskly through the apartment. He went straight into his office. I heard the pop of the hidden wall panel springing open, followed by the rapid turning of the safe's mechanical dial. A moment later, the distinct startup chime of a cell phone cut through the quiet. It was the burner phone. Pressing my ear closer to the crack, I strained to catch every single syllable. Preston spoke in a muted, strictly businesslike tone. I heard him confirm that the cake tasting was a complete success and that Maya was taking a nap. And then he uttered the exact words that confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. Speaking with a terrifying clinical detachment, he said, "The dosage is perfect. Her resting heart rate is dropping steadily. Up in the Alps, it's going to look exactly like natural altitude sickness. The heavy steel fire door felt like a block of ice against my spine. Holding my breath, I listened to his retreating footsteps fade away into the apartment. I waited until I heard the faint rustle of the living room rug, signaling that he was back in the main penthouse space, before slipping out of the stairwell and riding the service elevator down to the underground parking garage. My brain was racing with terrifying clarity. Bursting through the exit door, I walked briskly toward the rental car where Victor was waiting. Sliding into the passenger seat, I pulled the 2 stolen blue capsules from my pocket and tossed them onto the center console. I told Victor every single detail of what I had just overheard through the doorframe, repeating Preston's chilling words about altitude sickness and the perfect dosage. Victor didn't display a single shred of surprise. Throwing the car into drive with a look of quiet, intense focus, he told me we were heading to a trusted private laboratory on the north side of the city. We needed absolute verification before making our next move. The drive across town felt like a nightmare. Every red light was an agonizing delay, stealing precious seconds from my daughter's ticking clock. Finally, we pulled up to a nondescript concrete building in a quiet business park. The sign on the glass door read, "Advanced Analytical Solutions." Bypassing the reception desk entirely, Victor led me down a sterile, brightly lit hallway toward the testing facility at the back. Pushing open a swing door, he introduced me to Dr. Eris Thorne, an independent forensic toxicologist who owed Victor a favor. Eris was a quiet man with tired eyes, wearing a crisp white lab coat. He didn't ask a single unnecessary question about where the unmarked pills came from, or why a former federal investigator was bringing them in through the back door. Taking the capsules, he placed them in a sterile tray and told us the mass spectrometry analysis would take precisely 3 hours. He directed us to a small, windowless waiting room down the hall. Those 3 hours were the longest moments of my entire life. I paced the small room, the rhythmic thud of my boots measuring the agonizing march of time. I kept picturing Maya, her pale skin and those hollow, unfocused eyes. Finally, the heavy door clicked open, and Dr. Thorne stepped back into the room, holding a thick stack of printed analytical reports. His expression was grim, carrying the heavy weight of a doctor about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. Handing the top page to Victor, he looked me straight in the eye. He stated clearly that the blue capsules were not nutritional supplements, vitamins, or benign herbal remedies. They were a highly concentrated, lethal cocktail. With terrifying precision, he broke down the chemical breakdown. The primary component was a massive dose of a potent prescription beta blocker, engineered to artificially suppress human heart rate and drop blood pressure to dangerously low levels. The secondary compound was a heavy, fast-acting hypnotic sedative. Setting the paperwork down on the table, Dr. Thorne explained the deadly synergy of the combination. If a healthy person took those pills at sea level, they would experience extreme fatigue, severe lethargy, and a drastic drop in blood pressure that mirrored deep viral exhaustion. But if that same person took that precise cocktail and rapidly ascended to a high altitude, like the peaks of the Swiss Alps, the physiological results would be catastrophic. The thin mountain air would force the heart to pump harder to survive, while the beta blocker would forcibly prevent it from accelerating. The resulting cardiovascular crisis would trigger a massive, instantaneous cardiac arrest. It was a perfectly designed, untraceable execution method. It would look entirely like a tragic natural medical collapse brought on by severe altitude sickness. The toxicologist's words hit me like a wrecking ball. The room began to spin. A primal, suffocating rage exploded in my chest, shattering the cool, analytical control I had maintained for days. This was premeditated murder. Preston and Valerie were actively managing my daughter's chemical decline, preparing her body to die alone on a freezing mountain peak, all to collect a $10 million payout and inherit my life's work. I let out a guttural roar, a sound so raw and wild it sounded foreign even to my own ears. Grabbing the edge of the metal table until my knuckles turned bone white, I threw it straight across the room. It slammed into the drywall with a deafening crash. Turning toward the exit, my vision swam in a sea of red. I didn't care about plans, evidence, or authorities anymore. I was going to drive straight back to the penthouse, kick the oak door off its hinges, and tear Preston apart with my bare hands. I was going to strangle him. I grabbed the door handle, my muscles coiled with violent intent. But before I could turn it, Victor moved with terrifying speed. He slammed his heavy frame against the door, blocking my exit. I grabbed his shirt to throw him out of the way, but he didn't budge. Grabbing my shoulders, he slammed me back against the wall, pinning me in place with incredible strength. He glared straight into my furious eyes, his voice cutting through my panic like a sharp bark. He told me to stop acting like a reckless fool. He stated that if I walked into that penthouse and killed Preston today, I would spend the rest of my life rotting in a prison cell. And worse, Valerie would vanish into the shadows with the hidden assets, escaping justice entirely. Maya would be left behind, alone, traumatized, and completely exposed to whatever remained of their criminal network. Victor tightened his grip, his voice dropping to a cold, blade-like promise. He said we had to destroy them legally, systematically, and publicly. We had to trap them in a cage built from their own arrogance, exposing their monstrous deception right in front of everyone they had manipulated. Only then would Maya truly be safe. My hands slowly loosened from his shirt. The blind, fiery rage receded, replaced by a cold, calculated dark ocean of hatred. I nodded, breathing heavily, and accepted his terms. Smoothing down my jacket, I forced the engineer back to the surface. Victor stepped back and adjusted his collar, satisfied that the crisis had passed, before opening his laptop. He told me that while the toxicologist was running the analysis, he had conducted a deep algorithmic background check on Thomas Vance's past. He had locked on to open police reports, suspicious accidental deaths, and massive life insurance payouts tied to aliases used over the last decade. He said the Boston marriage certificate was merely the beginning. He had uncovered a terrifying, systematic pattern of lethal predation. Victor turned the laptop, so the screen faced me directly. He pulled up a scanned Florida newspaper clipping dated from exactly 2 years ago. The headline announced the sudden death of a wealthy heiress during a private yacht trip. Victor slapped his hand flat on the desk, pointing his finger directly at the grainy photograph of the grieving widower in the article. I leaned in close to the glowing screen, the harsh blue light reflecting off the smooth display and casting long shadows inside our small rental car. The headline practically screamed at me from the digital archive, the bold black letters burning a permanent mark onto my retinas. It read, "Wealthy heiress drowns during Miami honeymoon. Husband survives tragic accident." I stared at the grainy black and white photo below the text. The man in the picture stood on a wooden dock, his hands covering his face in a posture of dramatic, theatrical grief staged for the news cameras. He was younger then, with a slightly different haircut, but the sharp angles of his jaw and the cold, predatory posture of his shoulders were completely unmistakable. It was Preston, or rather Thomas Vance, perfecting his deadly craft 2 full years before he ever laid eyes on my daughter. Victor began reading the details of the police report aloud, his voice flat, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. The victim was a 32-year-old woman who had recently inherited a massive trust fund from her late father. They had been married for less than a month. During a private yacht charter off the coast of Florida, she supposedly slipped on a wet deck and fell into the dark, churning water late at night. By the time the Coast Guard arrived to conduct a search and rescue operation, it was far too late. The autopsy revealed heavy traces of potent prescription sleep aids in her system, but her new husband smoothly explained to investigators that she had been suffering from severe anxiety and debilitating insomnia leading up to the wedding. Local authorities ultimately ruled it a tragic accidental drowning. Preston walked away as a grieving widower, completely cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. He also walked away with a clean $5 million life insurance payout, wired directly into his private account without dispute. The horror of his past washed over me like a tidal wave, but the blinding red fury that had nearly consumed me in the lab was completely gone. In its place, a cold, absolute clarity took control of my brain. I was no longer dealing with a simple con man hungry for a quick payday. I was dealing with a deeply experienced, calculating, and methodical serial killer. He had done this before, he had gotten away with it flawlessly, and he was actively refining his deadly process to ensure he would never be caught. Maya was simply his next mark, a much larger financial payout that required a slightly more sophisticated execution, in the cold altitudes of the Swiss Alps rather than the warm waters of Miami. But a serial killer, no matter how smooth, charming, or experienced he might seem on the surface, is fundamentally arrogant. Preston believed he was the absolute smartest man in the room. He believed he had already secured his ultimate victory. Looking at me, he saw a grieving, obsolete old man he could easily sweep aside. He didn't realize that he had just declared war on a master builder. An engineer doesn't panic when he suddenly discovers a fatal structural flaw in a major building. He analyzes the complex blueprints, calculates the exact mathematical loads required, and constructs a permanent, unbreakable solution to eliminate the threat entirely. My daughter's life was the ultimate structure, and I was going to reinforce her fragile foundation with an iron cage of undeniable, devastating evidence. I was going to build a trap so meticulous in every detail and so airtight from every conceivable angle that Preston would never see another sunrise. I had Victor print out every single page of the Florida police report, carefully packaging it alongside the toxicologist's fatal chemical analysis. Picking up my phone, I immediately dialed the private number for Richard Lawson. Richard was my personal estate attorney, a man I had trusted for over 25 years. Brilliant and sharp, he had expertly helped me navigate complex zoning laws and massive corporate acquisitions to build my entire commercial real estate empire. I told him this was a matter of absolute life and death, demanding that he meet me at his private office in downtown Dallas immediately. The flight back to Texas was a blur of cold, calculated strategy. As the early morning sun began to rise over the city skyline, I walked into Richard's beautifully paneled mahogany office. I didn't waste a single second on pleasantries or small talk. I threw the thick envelope Victor had prepared directly onto the center of his polished desk. But before Richard could even look at the criminal background checks or the toxicological report, I pulled a separate, pristine document from my inner jacket pocket. It was the medical power of attorney form, the very document Preston had practically shoved in my face during our confrontation at the penthouse. I told Richard that Preston had adamantly claimed the form was standard procedure to protect Maya's personal assets and ensure her medical care during routine emergencies. I demanded that Richard read every single line, every hidden clause, and every obscure footnote of legal jargon. Adjusting his glasses, Richard began scanning the document. The spacious room was dead silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning unit and the crisp rustle of heavy paper. I watched his eyes move back and forth across the densely printed pages. At first, his expression was completely neutral, analyzing the text with his usual professional detachment. But as he reached the third page, a dramatic shift occurred. The healthy coal color drained rapidly from his cheeks. His jaw dropped slightly, and a fine layer of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He reread the final paragraph, tracing his index finger over the tiny fine print, as if he couldn't believe the words right in front of him. Lowering the document onto the smooth leather surface of his desk, he took off his glasses with trembling hands. Looking up at me, his eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated horror. When he finally broke the heavy silence of the office, his voice shook. He told me that this wasn't a standard, protective medical proxy. It was an irrevocable, ironclad death warrant wrapped in deceptive legal phrasing. Leaning forward, Richard gripped the edge of his desk and laid out the devastating truth. He said, "Harrison, if you allow Maya to sign this document, Preston will be granted absolute, unquestionable medical authority over her life. If she suffers a cardiac arrest on that mountain and slips into a coma, he holds the sole legal right to pull the plug immediately. This document explicitly strips away all of your parental rights. You will have absolutely no say, and he will legally end her life while the doctors simply step back and watch." An absolute stillness fell over Richard's office. Staring at the terrifying piece of paper on the desk, I felt a strange, paradoxical sense of calm wash over me. An ordinary man would have ripped that paper to shreds. A terrified father would have called the police immediately to shut the wedding down by force. But I'm an engineer. When you find a structural vulnerability in an enemy's stronghold, you don't seal the tunnel. You line it with explosives and wait for them to step inside. Looking straight into Richard's pale, terrified eyes, I told him we weren't going to stop the medical power of attorney. Richard visibly recoiled, reminding me that signing the document was tantamount to signing my daughter's death warrant. I held up my hand to quiet his rising panic. I explained that Preston was a meticulous, calculating predator who anticipated resistance. If I suddenly blocked his carefully drafted legal trap, he would instantly realize his cover was blown. He would abort the operation, drain whatever accounts he currently had access to, and vanish into the shadows long before we could mount a proper defense. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute victory. I instructed Richard to draft a secondary, highly complex legal strategy, a poison pill clause, buried deep inside a completely separate trust document that Preston would also be required to sign at the rehearsal dinner. This invisible clause would instantly void the medical power of attorney the second his pen left the paper, while simultaneously triggering an immediate, sweeping asset freeze against every account linked to his name. As Richard's sharp legal mind grasped the sheer, destructive elegance of the trap, his breathing stabilized. He nodded slowly, a cold, ruthless smile creeping across his face. He promised that the clause would be completely undetectable to anyone other than a seasoned trust attorney. Leaving Richard at his desk typing furiously, I drove straight to the heavily fortified federal building downtown. I wasn't planning on walking into the public lobby to file a general complaint with a low-level desk agent. Bypassing standard security protocols entirely, I used a private phone number I had kept saved for 15 years. I called Marcus Thorne, the special agent in charge of the local FBI field office. 20 years ago, Marcus was a brilliant, driven young agent whose career was nearly destroyed by a corrupt bureaucratic technicality. Using my considerable political influence and financial resources, I ensured he received fair treatment, funding a massive legal defense that ultimately saved his career and propelled him to his current position of power. Marcus owed me his life, and today, I'm finally calling in the favor. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting inside his secure, soundproof office. Marcus gave me a warm, genuine embrace, but the moment he saw the cold, dead look in my eyes, his smile vanished. Unzipping my heavy briefcase, I laid the nightmare out across his desk. I showed him the certified toxicologist's report detailing the lethal chemical cocktail of beta blockers and sedatives Preston was feeding my daughter. I presented Victor's algorithmic background check, exposing the completely fabricated Boston estate and revealing Thomas Vance's true identity as a convicted felon. Finally, I pushed the grainy, black and white newspaper clipping from Florida across the polished surface. Marcus read through the horrific details of the first wife's accidental drowning, his trained eyes connecting the dots of the serial killer's dark playbook. The air inside the secure room grew heavy. Leaning back in his chair, Marcus ran a hand over his face. He told me it was a textbook, highly sophisticated predatory operation. He confirmed that Preston was running a flawlessly executed long con, exploiting jurisdictional gaps between state and international laws to evade detection. Marcus explained the stark, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence, Victor and I had gathered in Boston. Prosecuting a man for premeditated murder before the actual crime took place was extraordinarily difficult. The Florida case had been closed as an accident, and the toxicological evidence from the stolen pills could easily be spun by a clever defense lawyer as a pharmaceutical error. Marcus looked at me with a stern, unwavering intensity. He stated that to lock Preston away in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life, they needed to catch him in the middle of committing a massive, undeniable felony. The FBI agreed to authorize a full undercover sting operation, but they required an absolute ironclad trigger. You know how she is, Dad. Marcus explained that wire fraud and federal identity theft carried strict mandatory minimum sentences. If Preston knowingly used his forged alias to execute those fraudulent trust documents with the full intention of extorting millions from a federally insured financial institution, the Bureau could swoop in and bust the operation immediately. The plan was remarkably simple, yet terrifyingly dangerous. The rehearsal dinner would serve as the epicenter of the sting. Undercover federal agents would infiltrate the country club, disguised as waitstaff, valet attendants, and audio-visual technicians. The entire private dining room would be rigged with hidden high-definition cameras and directional microphones. But the entire operation hinged on a single, fragile point of failure. Preston had to physically pick up the pen and sign his fake name on the dotted line. At the exact moment he committed the fraud, he had to feel completely safe, extraordinarily confident, and utterly victorious. If he sensed even a fraction of a millimeter of danger, if he detected even a microscopic flaw in the environment, he would refuse to sign, and the entire federal trap would collapse in an instant. The immense weight of the situation settled onto my shoulders like a suffocating lead blanket. Leaving the imposing federal building, I drove slowly toward my empty house. The sun was beginning to sink beneath the Texas horizon, casting long streaks of bloody orange and violent red across the sky. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin in less than 4 hours. Walking into my quiet master bathroom, I splashed freezing water over my exhausted face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, watching the droplets run down the deep lines around my eyes. I was about to walk into an elegant, crowded dining room and sit down to dinner with the monster planning to murder my only child. I would have to toast him, deliver a heartfelt speech, and look directly into the cold, dead eyes of a serial killer without showing a single trace of the furious volcano burning inside my chest. If my smile faltered for even a second, if my hands trembled, or if my voice carried a hint of poison, Preston would run. Adjusting my silk tie, I buried the terrified father deep within myself and let the cold, calculating engineer take over once more. Turning away from the mirror, I walked out the front door. It took exactly 45 minutes to drive from my quiet estate to the grand ballroom of the 5-star hotel in downtown Dallas. I used every single second of that commute to bury my rage as a father beneath a thick, impenetrable shield of feigned submission. Handing my keys to the valet, I deliberately let my shoulders slump, making my footsteps heavy and labored. I passed through the soaring glass doors and stepped into the lavishly decorated foyer. The rehearsal dinner was a grand exhibition of manufactured wealth, financed entirely by my own bank account. The city's 150 most elite, influential citizens were gathered inside that room. There were prominent real estate developers, local politicians, and wealthy socialites, all dressed in their finest formal wear. They casually walked around sipping expensive champagne and exchanging pleasantries, completely oblivious that they were nothing more than background extras in a meticulously staged theater of deception. Pausing at the arched entryway of the ballroom, I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I let my face fall, slipping on a mask of total emotional exhaustion. I was no longer the sharp, imposing engineer who built skyscrapers. I was just a tired, broken old man finally surrendering his entire legacy to the passage of time. I moved slowly through the sea of impeccably dressed guests, forcing weak, polite smiles to my colleagues and business partners. The soft hum of classical music and polite chatter filled the massive room. Before I could even reach the private head table, a smooth, sickeningly familiar voice cut through the noise. Preston emerged from the crowd, wearing a custom tuxedo that fit his athletic frame perfectly. Stepping directly into my path, a bright, magnanimous smile covered his handsome face. It was the beaming, terrifying smile of a predator absolutely convinced he had consumed his prey. Reaching out, he took my hand in a firm, completely dominant handshake while bringing his other hand up to clap me hard on the shoulder. He loudly thanked me for coming, projecting the image of a gracious, forgiving son-in-law to the surrounding guests. Leaning in close, his breath warm against my ear, he whispered that he was glad I had decided to be reasonable. He smelled of expensive cologne and pure, unadulterated arrogance. Swallowing my disgust, I forced my eyes downward in a show of complete submission, quietly telling him that I only wanted my daughter to be happy. As Preston released my hand, Valerie slid over, her movements fluid and practiced. Wearing a striking crimson evening gown that drew eyes from half the room, she carried 2 crystal flutes filled with bubbling champagne. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, flashing with an almost undisguised hungry greed. Extending a manicured hand with a perfectly rehearsed expression of familial warmth, she offered me a glass. In a voice dripping with artificial sweetness, she told me how thrilled they were to bring our families together tonight. Taking the delicate flute, my fingers brushed against hers. I knew the terrifying truth about the woman standing before me. She wasn't a supportive sister welcoming me into her circle. She was the cold, calculating wife of a convicted felon, a willing accomplice to serial murder, eagerly anticipating her massive financial payout. Forcing a polite nod, I thanked her for her so-called kindness and raised the glass to my lips, but didn't let a single drop pass my teeth. I carefully set the untouched champagne down on a passing waiter's tray. Shifting my focus away from the monstrous couple, I looked toward the center of the massive head table, and my heart broke into 1,000 jagged pieces. Maya sat quietly in a high-backed velvet chair, looking utterly isolated amidst the swirling celebration. The damage that the deadly chemical cocktail had inflicted on her body was absolute devastation. My beautiful, vibrant daughter looked like a fragile ghost of her former self. Her usually bright, expressive eyes were now sunken and dim, framed by dark, bruise-like shadows. Her skin had a terrifying, translucent paleness devoid of any healthy color. She was visibly trembling, her delicate hands gripping the edge of the heavy table just to keep herself upright in her chair. She looked utterly exhausted, lost in a suffocating chemical fog that prevented her from recognizing the immediate danger surrounding her. I wanted to surge forward, tear her away from that table, and carry her out of the building. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught a subtle, fleeting movement. A tall man in a catering captain's uniform subtly adjusted his earpiece. Near the back wall, a technician managing the ambient lighting subtly shifted a hidden camera lens. Marcus and his federal agents were in position completely invisible to the untrained eye. The trap was set and waiting. I had to hold my ground. Walking over to the head table, I took my designated seat next to my daughter. Maya turned her head slowly, her movements sluggish and deeply uncoordinated. She gave me a weak, trembling smile, whispering that she was glad I was there. Gently taking her cold, clammy hand in mine, I silently promised her that the nightmare was about to end. The lavish multi-course dinner commenced, with course after course of fine culinary creations tasting like ash in my mouth. The elite guests laughed and drank, completely unaware of the deadly stakes playing out at the front of the room. Preston commanded the space, enchanting the entire table with manufactured stories of generational wealth and corporate success. He played the devoted partner flawlessly, occasionally leaning in to kiss Maya's pale cheek or whisper fake reassurances into her ear. Every affectionate gesture he made was a calculated move to reinforce his perfect alibi. I sat in silence, eating nothing, my eyes fixed on the white tablecloth. With absolute, unwavering discipline, I played the heartbroken, isolated father. I allowed the minutes to stretch into hours, waiting with the cold patience of a sniper, waiting for the designated target to step into the crosshairs. "You know how she is, Dad." As the undercover federal agents cleared away the final dessert plates, the ambient noise in the ballroom began to settle naturally. Preston rose gracefully from his chair, holding a fresh glass of champagne high in his right hand. He tapped the edge of the crystal glass with a silver spoon, the crisp chime instantly commanding the room. 150 influential guests fell completely silent, turning their expectant faces toward the head table. Preston smiled warmly, his charismatic gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd before landing entirely on me. He spoke in a booming, dramatic voice that echoed off the high ceilings. He announced that before the dancing began, my wonderful father-in-law had a special, profound gift to officially present to the couple. He declared that it was time for the formal signing of the family trust. Reaching into the inner pocket of his custom jacket, Preston pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Sliding the deadly medical power of attorney along with a heavy gold pen across the polished wood table, he placed them directly toward my hands. The entire room watched in absolute silence. The heavy gold pen felt cold and foreign against the calluses of my aging fingers. Picking it up slowly, I turned it over in my hand, as if assessing its raw weight. The entire room remained suspended in a breathless, expectant hush. 150 pairs of influential eyes were locked on me, waiting for the defeated patriarch to officially sign away his empire before stepping back into the shadows. Lifting my head from the leather portfolio, I turned my eyes toward my daughter. Maya was slouched in her velvet chair, her eyelids fluttering heavily as she fought a losing battle against the heavy dose of invisible chemical sedatives coursing through her blood. She was completely unaware that the document laid before me was a legally binding death warrant designed to orchestrate her murder in the frozen European mountains. Shifting my gaze from her pale, fragile face, I looked directly at Preston. Leaning forward across the white tablecloth, his posture betrayed an intensely primal, predatory hunger. He was practically salivating, his dark eyes tracking the gold pen in my hand with an intense, intoxicating greed. He believed he had calculated every single variable, anticipated my emotional surrender, and weaponized my love for my child to secure his $10 million payout. Valerie sat beside him displaying the same barely concealed anticipation, her fingers tightly clutching the stem of her champagne glass. They were waiting for that final, decisive stroke of ink to cement their ultimate victory. I let the silence stretch for another agonizing moment, maintaining eye contact with a completely blank expression. I didn't rush. I allowed the heavy, suffocating pressure in the room to build until it felt almost tangible. Pushing my chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. I stood up straight, squaring my shoulders and shedding the carefully crafted persona of a tired, broken old man. Reaching across the table, I pulled the slender silver microphone from the center of the floral arrangement close to my mouth. I knew Marcus and his entire team of undercover federal agents were listening through their hidden earpieces, waiting for the audio trigger to initiate the sting. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic noise echoed like a gavel striking a block, resounding through the massive ballroom. The elite guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing a sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmospheric pressure. Looking out at the crowd, I brought my gaze back to Preston, locking onto his eyes with the cold, unyielding precision of a master builder analyzing a severe structural failure. I spoke in a deep, booming voice that carried effortlessly to the farthest corners of the room. 40 years ago, I built my very first skyscraper. I paused, allowing the profound weight of the statement to settle over the quiet audience. I explained that the fundamental rules of commercial engineering were remarkably simple. You can use the most expensive materials in the world, hire the most brilliant designers, and polish the exterior glass until it shines like diamonds in the sun. But if the foundation concrete is poured over unstable soil, the entire building is destined to collapse. Continuing, my eyes remained locked onto Preston. A structure built on lies will always crumble under the immense weight of its own deception. Preston's carefully maintained demeanor shifted subtly and dangerously. His smug, victorious smile faltered, replaced by a rigid, almost imperceptible tightening along his jawline. He sensed the sudden change in my tone. The underlying threat in my architectural metaphor was not lost on a man who had spent his entire adult life building elaborate illusions to trap vulnerable women. He cast a quick glance toward the emergency exit doors as his survival instincts finally began whispering warnings in his ear. Refusing to look away, I increased the pressure in my voice, allowing the absolute, volcanic rage I had been suppressing to finally seep into my carefully chosen words. I told the captivated audience that a family is like a massive steel structure. It requires unshakable honesty, absolute transparency, and a foundation built on genuine love to survive the turbulent storms of life. When parasites infiltrate that structure, when they systematically chisel away at the load-bearing walls and replace solid steel with toxic manipulation, the building becomes a fatal hazard to everyone inside. Lifting the gold pen into the air, I displayed it to the silent crowd like an undeniable piece of criminal evidence. I stated that the document resting on the table was not a standard trust agreement designed to protect my daughter. I declared that it was a highly complex, meticulously crafted trap, drafted by a man who had perfected the art of predatory destruction long before he ever set foot on Texas soil. A low, collective murmur of deep confusion swept through the ballroom. The wealthy guests exchanged bewildered glances, completely unsure whether this was a strange, scripted moment of rehearsal entertainment or a catastrophic public mental breakdown. Valerie lost her composure entirely. Standing up abruptly from her chair, the crimson dress rustled loudly against the fabric, her face a mask of furious outrage. Attempting to interrupt me, she raised her voice to loudly suggest that the emotional stress of the upcoming wedding had clearly caused me to suffer a severe mental breakdown. Reaching across the table, she frantically tried to snatch the leather portfolio from my hand. Slamming my left hand down flat onto the documents, The violent, booming crash flattened them against the table and rattled the crystal glasses, instantly silencing her frantic protest. Looking directly at Valerie, I stripped away the last remnants of my polite, socially acceptable mask. I told her to sit down and keep quiet, lest she deeply regret her actions. She froze, her eyes widening in sudden terror as she recognized the sheer menace radiating from my posture. I turned my attention back to Preston. The color had drained completely from his face. He was slowly pushing his chair back, preparing to make a run for the nearest emergency exit. He knew the game was completely over. He had walked directly into the trap, and the steel jaws were closing fast around his throat. Holding the gold pen, I hovered it over the signature line of the deadly medical power of attorney. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the final, decisive action. I looked at the man who had actively planned to murder my only child in the cold European mountains for a $10 million payout. I smiled, finally letting the predatory wolf show its teeth. I dropped the heavy pen. It clattered loudly against the polished wood, rolling away from the fraudulent document. Reaching deep into my jacket pocket, I pulled out my cell phone. Without saying another word, I looked into Preston's terrified eyes and deliberately pressed a single button on the glowing screen. Instantly, every light in the grand ballroom went completely dark. The sudden darkness plunged the grand ballroom into a state of total sensory deprivation. For a fraction of a second, the only sound in the massive space was the sharp, collective gasp of the city's 150 elite guests. The sudden disappearance of the shimmering chandeliers left a heavy, suffocating weight hanging over the white tablecloths. I stood motionless in the pitch black, my eyes adjusting quickly to the lack of light. I could hear the faint, nervous rustle of silk evening gowns and the anxious shifting of leather shoes against the marble floor. Beside me, I heard Preston let out a short, contemptuous huff, an arrogant scoff in the dark. He muttered something under his breath about a blown fuse or a technical failure by the hotel catering staff. He still believed he was in total control of the narrative. He still thought this was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to his victory parade. He had absolutely no idea that I had just detonated the explosives beneath his carefully constructed foundation. Then, a low mechanical hum began to vibrate from the ceiling at the far end of the room. It was the heavy, rhythmic operation of a massive digital projector mounting to the ceiling as it powered on. A blinding, high-definition beam of pure white light pierced the darkness, shooting directly over the heads of the bewildered guests and striking the massive canvas screen positioned directly behind the head table. The sudden glare cast long, distorted silhouettes against the wall. The crowd whispered in expectation, shifting in their seats as they anticipated a romantic montage of the happy couple. They waited for a curated slideshow showcasing smiling vacations, sunset dinners, and manufactured memories. Instead, the very first image that flashed across the massive screen was a high-resolution scan of a legal document, enlarged so immensely that even from the very back row of the dining room, the crisp black text was completely legible. The bright light washed over the upturned faces of the audience, illuminating their expressions of polite curiosity. It took merely 3 seconds for collective realization to hit. The document projected behind us was the marriage certificate from Clark County, Nevada. The names Thomas Vance and Valerie Vance were printed in bold, undeniable letters directly above their legal signatures, complete with an official government seal and a filing date from 8 years ago. A sharp, unified gasp erupted from the center of the room. It rolled through the crowd like a shockwave, the physical manifestation of their sudden shock and understanding. Influential politicians, wealthy developers, and high society patrons sat frozen, their champagne glasses forgotten midair. The illusion of a loving, supportive sister shattered in an instant, broadcast in 10-foot-tall letters for the entire city to see. I turned my head slowly to look at Valerie. The light from the projector hit her face in a harsh, unflattering glare. Her mouth hung open as she stared at the screen, the color draining so rapidly from her cheeks that her skin looked like chalk. She looked like a trapped animal paralyzed by a sudden, blinding spotlight. Preston leaped from his chair, sending it crashing backward onto the floor with a loud thud. He began wildly waving his arms, shouting into the darkness for hotel management to cut the power, claiming it was a malicious prank or a terrible forgery. But his smooth, charismatic voice was now laced with a sharp, unmistakable edge of pure panic. Under the intense weight of public exposure, the mask was slipping and cracking apart. Ignoring his frantic shouting, I kept my hand casually in my pocket and pressed a small button on my phone a second time. The projector let out a loud click, advancing the presentation to the next slide. "You know how she is, Dad." The marriage certificate vanished, replaced by a split-screen display. On the left was the grainy newspaper clipping from Florida, detailing the tragic drowning death of a wealthy heiress during her honeymoon. On the right was the official forensic autopsy report, clearly highlighting the presence of heavy prescription sleep aids in the victim's system. The headline announcing the survival of the grieving husband was magnified, with an arrow pointing directly from the name Thomas Vance in the police report to a high-quality, undeniable photo of Preston standing on that Miami dock 2 years ago. The murmurs in the ballroom escalated into loud, panicked whispers. The guests were no longer merely confused, they were terrified. Looking at the man they had just shared a meal with, they realized they were dining with a predator. The air in the room turned cold, filled with the undeniable reality of premeditated murder. I watched prominent real estate developers lean backward, physically pulling themselves away from the monster standing in the center of the room. Preston spun in circles, his hands frantically tearing at his hair as he screamed for the hotel staff to shut the projector down. He was unraveling completely, his perfect, unshakable facade utterly dismantled by the undeniable truth shining brightly behind him. I pressed the button on my phone a third and final time. The screen flickered once more, delivering the fatal, crushing blow. The image shifted to the certified toxicologist's report from Dr. Eris Thorne. The stark, clinical text detailed the exact chemical breakdown of the heavy dose of beta blockers and hypnotic sedatives. Placed directly beside the laboratory results was a crisp, clear photograph of the blue capsules sitting inside the amber prescription bottle labeled Maya's Vitamins. The text on the screen clearly explained how the chemical cocktail was specifically engineered to induce a massive cardiac arrest at high altitudes, mimicking a tragic, natural death on the mountain. The ballroom erupted into absolute, unmanageable chaos. Chairs were shoved aside as guests scrambled to their feet. Shouts of fear and disbelief echoed off the high ceilings. Women covered their mouths, and men shouted for someone to call the police. The elegant, refined rehearsal dinner was instantly transformed into a terrifying theater of criminal exposure. But the most profound reaction didn't come from the wealthy crowd. It came from the chair beside me that had been occupied moments before. The sudden screams, the blinding glare of the projector, and the chaotic energy vibrating through the room finally pierced the heavy, suffocating chemical fog that had enveloped my daughter's mind for weeks. A violent surge of pure adrenaline broke through the heavy sedatives. Maya snapped her head up. Her breathing turned fast and shallow. Pressing her hands flat against the polished wood table, her knuckles turning white, she forced herself to sit completely upright. Turning her head slowly, her sunken, exhausted eyes tracked the massive letters on the bright screen. She read the toxicologist's report. The devastating reality hit her, shattering her beautiful, manufactured illusion of a perfect romance. Turning her gaze away from the screen, she looked directly at the man she had planned to marry. Preston stood frozen beside the head table. He looked at my daughter, her eyes wide with absolute horror, realizing he had walked blindly into a slaughterhouse. There was nowhere left to hide. An absolute silence held over the grand ballroom for a fraction of a second before the sickening reality of the projected images shattered the elegant atmosphere. Valerie was the first to react to the blinding exposure. The delicate, warm illusion of the loving sister evaporated in an instant, replaced entirely by the primal, terrified instincts of a cornered animal. Kicking her velvet chair backward, the heavy wood scraped violently against the polished marble floor as she sprinted toward the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. Moving with a sudden, desperate speed, the heavy silk of her crimson evening gown ripped slightly as her expensive heels slipped on the smooth stone. She clearly thought she saw a fleeting gap, a narrow, unguarded escape route into the dark service hallways that would lead her safely to the underground parking garage. But she severely underestimated the ironclad perimeter I had quietly built around the room. As her hands slammed desperately against the swinging doors, A massive, unyielding shadow stepped directly into her path. It was Victor. He offered no verbal warning and made no attempt to read her rights. He simply extended a large, calloused hand, grabbing the thick fabric of her expensive dress at the shoulder before spinning her around with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. Slamming her hard against the solid structural wall, a heavy, sickening thud echoed through the air. The oxygen left her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. Victor pinned her firmly in place, his impenetrable face a mask of cold, professional fury, effectively shutting down her frantic escape before she could even make it out of the chaotic dining room. The surrounding elite guests scattered, screaming in blind panic. I didn't waste a single glance on Valerie. My eyes were locked entirely on Preston. The devastating realization of his absolute failure triggered a horrific physical transformation. His handsome, charismatic mask literally melted away right before my eyes, exposing the psychopathic, cold-blooded killer hidden beneath his expensive tuxedo. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could almost hear the violent grinding of his teeth over the rising screams of the crowd. The smooth, calculated suitor who had so easily charmed his way into my daughter's vulnerable life was gone, replaced by a cornered predator, suddenly realizing the steel jaws had irrevocably closed around his neck. He stared wildly at the massive projection screen displaying his past actions, then looked down at the heavy gold pen lying uselessly on the white tablecloth. Federal agents disguised as catering staff and technicians were tightening their circle, moving through the panicked crowd with their hands resting near hidden holsters. Preston knew he was trapped, but his overwhelming arrogance refused to let him surrender quietly. A harsh, guttural scream tore from his throat. He slammed his large hands onto the table, sweeping heavy silver utensils, champagne flutes, and delicate floral arrangements onto the floor. He charged straight at me, his hands curling into tight fists in a desperate attempt to strike back. He fully expected me to cower in fear, just like the frail, broken old man I had been pretending to be all evening. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back, and I certainly didn't raise my hands to defend myself. All night, I had been leaning heavily on a thick, solid oak cane, playing up the illusion of health and extreme physical weakness. Preston had dismissed the cane as nothing more than a pathetic prop for an aging man. He made a catastrophic mistake. It was a perfectly balanced, dense piece of solid wood. As he closed the short distance between us, his face twisted in rage, I smoothly shifted my weight and planted my feet with absolute stability. Grasping the polished brass handle with both hands, I rotated my hips and swung the solid oak stick with everything I had. I didn't aim for his head or his broad chest. I calculated the exact downward trajectory needed to stop his momentum cold. The heavy wood struck the side of his left knee. The sound of impact was deafening, a sharp crack echoing over the screams of the crowd. Preston's forward rush stopped instantly. Under the immense force of that precise blow, the joint gave out completely. His leg buckled, his angry yell instantly turned into a sharp cry of agony, and he hit the cold marble floor hard. Completely immobilized, he clutched his ruined knee as undercover federal agents swarmed in from the shadows. Agents quickly surrounded the front of the room, their voices booming with absolute authority as they ordered the terrified guests to back away and commanded Preston to stay still. Bright red and blue lights from multiple police cruisers suddenly illuminated the tall glass windows, casting long shadows across the decorated walls. The trap had closed with flawless precision. Even as he writhed on the cold stone floor in pain, completely surrounded by federal officers, Preston's arrogance refused to die. He looked up at me, pale and gasping through clenched teeth. He sneered, making a pathetic attempt to regain his old sense of superiority. He spat out desperate words, trying to claw back some control. He shouted at the top of his lungs that I had zero evidence against him. He screamed that I was nothing more than a paranoid old man who had just assaulted him in front of over 100 witnesses. With a trembling finger, he pointed at the black leather portfolio lying untouched on the tablecloth above him. He yelled that he hadn't actually signed anything, and without his signature on that legal document, I could never prove intent in a court of law. He genuinely believed he had found a microscopic legal loophole to slip through. I slowly lowered my oak cane and stepped closer to the edge of the table. Leaning down until my mouth was just inches from the silver microphone, I looked straight into his eyes. I spoke with quiet, absolute certainty. "Oh, but you already did." As my words hung in the air, a sharp burst of microphone feedback echoed through the hall. Preston's face twisted into a bizarre mix of pain and utter confusion. Clutching his knee, his chest heaving, he stared up at me from the marble floor, desperately trying to find a flaw in my statement. He gasped through his teeth, demanding to know what I meant, insisting again that his name wasn't on any binding contract. I walked around, the shattered glass and silver scattered across the floor. Looking down at the man squirming at my feet, I delivered the final, decisive blow to his collapsing world. In a calm, steady voice, I told him he was completely right about the family trust document on the table. He hadn't signed it yet, but his narrow, arrogant mind had been focused on the wrong trap all along. I informed him that wire fraud and extortion were never the main charges I cared about. Those were merely secondary tools designed to guarantee federal jurisdiction over his case. Stepping closer to the mic, ensuring every guest, every agent, and my terrified daughter could hear the absolute truth, I asked him a simple, devastating question. I asked if he truly believed that over the last 72 hours, he had actually been giving Maya her targeted medication. The color drained from Preston's face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. His eyes darted toward Maya, who sat frozen in her velvet chair, listening to every word with terrifying clarity. I didn't give him a single second to spin a lie. Raising my voice, I let the authority of a protective father fill the room. I revealed how, 3 days ago, I had walked into their supposedly secure luxury penthouse while they were completely distracted by fraudulent wedding preparations. I explained how easily I had bypassed his expensive locks, avoided his security cameras, and located the hidden steel safe behind the drywall in his home office. I watched absolute terror replace the anger in his eyes as he finally realized the scale of his miscalculation. I detailed how I had carefully opened his safe and pulled out the cheap plastic tray inside. I told him about the prescription bottle labeled with my daughter's name and how I had immediately taken those capsules to an independent toxicologist to analyze their dangerous chemical composition. Then, I revealed the most critical step of my entire counterplan. Looking directly into his panicked eyes, I told him I had meticulously replaced every single one of those heavy sedative pills with a completely harmless, inert placebo. A collective gasp of shock rippled through the gathered crowd of socialites and politicians. The horrifying reality of a calculated conspiracy was now undeniable. I kept dismantling his entire operation. I stated that the actual harmful substances he had procured to cause a life-threatening medical emergency high in the European mountains were no longer in his possession. I had personally handed those substances directly to the FBI, along with the burner phone he used to secretly order them. I explained that federal forensic technicians had already extracted his digital fingerprints, encrypted messages, and precise location data from that device. Without even knowing it, he had handed federal authorities an airtight, irrefutable record of his malicious intent. Maya let out a sharp, trembling breath. "You know how she is, Dad?" The heavy fog that had clouded her mind for months instantly vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization of what she had barely escaped. She stared at the man she had loved, the man who had whispered sweet promises about the future while systematically administering harmful doses of hidden substances. Preston tried to crawl backward across the floor, dragging his injured leg, pathetically trying to shrink away from the benevolent spotlight. He was completely trapped. Before he could pull together one last lie, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the hall were thrown wide open. The loud impact echoed like thunder, breaking the remaining tension in the room. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured into the elegant space. Their tactical gear stood out in stark, grim contrast to the formal evening wear of the panicked guests. The lead agent, Special Agent Marcus Thorne, walked down the central aisle with total authority. Pointing a firm finger at the man on the floor, he ordered his team to secure the primary suspect. 2 large agents moved in, grabbing Preston by his jacket and pulling him up. As his injured knee caught his weight, he let out a sharp cry. They pressed him down onto the polished wood of the main table and brought his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy handcuffs locking around his wrists resonated through the silent room with absolute finality. Preston struggled wildly in their grip, his former charm completely replaced by the chaotic thrashing of a caught criminal. He yelled desperate, incoherent threats into the air as the fraudulent life he built crumbled beyond repair. At the same time, a second team converged near the service corridor by the kitchen. The heavy doors swung open as Victor escorted Valerie back into the room. Her crimson dress was torn, her styled hair completely disheveled. She screamed frantically against the steel cuffs around her wrists, demanding a lawyer. The federal agents ignored her protests, flanking her as they marched her toward the main exit alongside her accomplice. Both were led out into the flashing red and blue lights of waiting law enforcement vehicles, their elaborate setup permanently shut down. I turned my attention away from the departing suspects and looked down at my daughter. Maya was shaking violently, her pale hands clutching the edge of the tablecloth. The overwhelming realization of how close she had come to a dark, isolated fate hit her all at once. Letting out a shaky, heartbreaking sob, she collapsed completely into my open arms. I pulled her in close, holding my terrified, deeply relieved child with everything I had. The chaos of the ballroom slowly dissolved into a quiet echo. The high society guests, who had been eager participants in this display of artificial wealth, quickly dispersed into the cold night, leaving behind a scene of ruined luxury. Overturned velvet chairs, shattered glass, and trampled floral arrangements lay scattered across the marble floor like casualties of a silent war. The heavy oak doors remained wide open, allowing a cool draft from the lobby to sweep away the lingering sense of expensive cologne and artificial sweetness. A small team of federal agents remained near the kitchen, meticulously bagging legal documents and securing the ruined tables as official, irrefutable evidence. The flashing lights outside slowly faded into the distance, replaced by the steady glow of the city skyline, a reminder that life went on outside this nightmare. I stayed seated at the main table, the center of the shattered illusion, wrapping my suit jacket around my daughter's trembling shoulders. Behind us, the massive projector had been shut off, leaving the screen dark. Maya rested her head against my chest, her breathing finally slowing to a steady, natural rhythm as her body slowly cleared the last traces of the heavy sedatives. The nightmare was over. We were alone in the vast room, surrounded by the physical ruins of a trap, but the suffocating pressure was completely gone. Maya moved slightly, her hands reaching up to clutch my lapel. She looked up, her expressive eyes searching my face with a heartbreaking mix of deep gratitude and crushing guilt. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks, catching the dim, ambient light. When she spoke, her voice was fragile and shaking. She apologized. She repeated the word over and over, burying her face back into my chest, crying for the illusion she had so desperately wanted to believe. She told me how sorry she was for pushing me away over the last 6 months, for ignoring my valid concerns, and for blindly accusing me of being a jealous, paranoid father who refused to let her grow up. She admitted that Preston had isolated her, whispering toxic lies into her ear about how I was trying to control her inheritance and destroy her happiness. Sobbing, her small frame shaking, she asked herself how she could have been so blind, looking into the eyes of a cold-hearted liar every day and seeing only a loving partner. I gently stroked her hair and kissed the top of her head, feeling an unconditional love that bypassed any past misunderstandings. Keeping my voice low, steady, and soothing, I anchored her to the reality of the moment. I told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. Predators like Preston and Valerie don't pick their targets because those targets are weak or foolish. They targeted her precisely because she had a kind, trusting, and empathetic heart. They weaponized her best qualities, using her own goodness as a blindfold to hide their true intentions. I lifted her chin, forcing her to meet my eyes. I told her that, from the moment I first held her in the delivery room, my only job in this world was to be her shield. A father doesn't stop protecting his child just because the child believes they are safe. To ensure she could draw her next breath, I would gladly dismantle every building I ever built, burn my wealth to ashes, and step into danger 1,000 times over. As I saw true understanding and relief settle onto her exhausted face, the crushing weight of the last 3 days finally lifted from my shoulders. She wrapped her arms around my neck, holding on with immense strength, anchoring herself to the one person who had never lied to her. We sat together in the quiet, ruined hall for another hour, letting the adrenaline fade from our systems. A polite federal agent eventually approached the table, letting us know our official statements had been fully processed and we were clear to return home. I nodded, thanking him for his professionalism. Leaning on my solid oak cane, I slowly stood up, the fading adrenaline finally reminding my aging joints of the physical toll the night had taken. I held out my free hand to Maya. She took it firmly, her grip steady and surprisingly strong. Together, we walked slowly through the debris of the rehearsal dinner, past the shattered remnants of a dangerous deception, and out through the arched entrance. We crossed the hotel lobby, our footsteps echoing softly on the marble, leaving that dark chapter of our lives behind. Stepping through the tall glass doors into the crisp Dallas night air, we took a deep, clearing breath. The storm that had threatened to destroy our family had passed, leaving behind a clear sky lit by millions of distant stars. The generational wealth I spent a lifetime building was completely secure, entirely shielded from greedy hands. The complex trust documents and medical powers of attorney were permanently seized as key federal evidence, destined to sit in a locker forever. Preston and Valerie were sitting in cold, isolated federal interrogation rooms, facing a mountain of physical evidence. Federal prosecutors were already preparing a massive indictment, including multiple counts of attempted murder, interstate wire fraud, and conspiracy. They were facing the absolute certainty of spending the rest of their lives behind the walls of a maximum security federal facility, without the slightest chance of parole. Their names were erased from our lives, reduced to a brief, cautionary tale. When the valet brought my car to the front entrance, I looked over at my daughter. The ordeal had taken away her innocence, but it hadn't broken her spirit. The bond between us had survived a test of pure malice, coming out stronger and forged like steel. We climbed into the quiet safety of the vehicle, ready to finally head home and start rebuilding our lives. A full year has passed since that dark, chaotic night in downtown Dallas, and a quiet, comforting peace has returned to our estate. The federal trial moved remarkably fast, operating like an unstoppable machine of justice. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence, certified toxicology reports, the recovered burner phone, and newly uncovered links to a past case in Florida, Preston and Valerie completely dropped their confident act. To avoid the harshest possible sentences, both quickly accepted plea deals. They are now serving mandatory life sentences inside the windowless walls of a maximum security federal prison. 6 months ago, they filed a desperate appeal, claiming I had set them up and fabricated the digital evidence, but the federal judge dismissed it almost instantly. Maya moved back into our home for several quiet, healing months. It was a long, delicate process of physical and emotional recovery. I watched the heavy fog gradually lift from her mind. Vibrant, healthy color returned to her cheeks, completely replacing the pale complexion that had haunted my nightmares. Today, her contemporary art gallery is thriving, more successful than ever, filled with light and genuine success. Every Sunday morning, we sit on the wide wooden porch, drinking hot coffee, talking easily about everything and nothing at all. That night, I didn't just save my daughter's life. I brought my best friend back from the edge of a cliff. The emotional scars take time to heal completely, but we are committed to walking that path together every single day. As for Dominic, the brilliant tailor who physically pushed me into that small fitting room and insisted I listen to the truth, he hasn't had to pay for a meal or a drink anywhere in this city ever since. I personally made sure of that vital detail. Sometimes the universe hands you a life-saving revelation wrapped inside a nightmare. When that rare moment comes, you can't panic. You simply stay quiet, listen to the hidden truths, and meticulously prepare your response. To every devoted parent listening to my story right now, remember one crucial rule. Never let the temporary fear of pushing your child away stop you from trusting your instincts. Calculating, patient predators don't walk around with obvious warning signs. They disguise themselves as everything your child has ever wanted. They use charm as a weapon and isolation as a tool to gain control. If someone new enters your family's life and the dynamic suddenly turns toxic, or if your independent child drastically changes their behavior, don't just step aside and mind your own business. Investigate the shadows. Laughed about it. Ask the uncomfortable questions that no one else has the courage to ask out loud. It is far better to be viewed as unreasonable or overprotective for a month than to spend the rest of your life grieving a tragedy that could have been prevented. If this story proved to you that a parent's love is an unbreakable shield against the darkest intentions, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel today so you never miss another story of survival, deep family bonds, and undeniable justice. Let me know in the comments below which city you're watching from today. I love reading your responses. I'll see you in the next story. Stay safe out there.